This document serves as a comprehensive analysis of what has become known as the Terra Incident, a series of events that fundamentally altered the power dynamics within the Galactic Federation and redefined our understanding of the species designation previously classified as harmless herbivores from the third planet of the Sol system. The incident, which began as routine intimidation tactics employed by the Apex Predator Coalition against newly inducted Terran representatives, culminated in what military analysts now refer to as the most decisive tactical victory by an outnumbered force in recorded galactic history. The events detailed herein demonstrate the catastrophic miscalculation made by established predator species who failed to recognize that humanity's greatest strength lies not in their physical capabilities, but in their psychological resilience and capacity for strategic adaptation under extreme pressure. As one surviving witness stated, "We thought we were hunting prey. We discovered we had cornered something far more dangerous than any apex predator, a species that had already conquered its own weaknesses." Part 1. The gathering storm. The tension began building 3 standard months prior to the incident during the 2387 Galactic Trade Summit on Kepler Station. Humanity, having recently achieved faster-than-light travel capabilities, had been granted provisional membership status within the Galactic Federation, a decision that sparked considerable controversy among the established apex predator species. Ambassador Sarah Chen, representing Terra in her first major diplomatic assignment, found herself facing what intelligence reports later revealed to be a coordinated intimidation campaign. The Krillian hegemony, led by War Prime Zefkar, had formed an unofficial alliance with the Vorthak hunting clans and the Ninth Collective, 3 of the galaxy's most feared predator civilizations. Each species had evolved as apex hunters on their respective worlds, with kill counts that spanned millennia and reputations that preceded them across star systems. The intimidation began subtly. During the opening ceremonies, Ambassador Chen's assigned quarters were mysteriously relocated to a section of the station known for its environmental irregularities, atmospheric pressure fluctuations, temperature variations, and what the station's AI diplomatically termed acoustic anomalies that prevented restful sleep. When Chen requested reassignment, she was informed that all other diplomatic quarters were fully occupied, despite sensor readings that indicated multiple vacant suites in the premium sector. The harassment escalated during formal proceedings. War Prime Zefkar, standing nearly 3 meters tall with chitinous armor that bore the scars of 1,000 battles, would position himself directly in Chen's line of sight during sessions, his 4 predatory eyes fixed upon her with an intensity that made even veteran diplomats uncomfortable. The Krillians had a saying, "Fear is the first meal of victory." Zefkar believed that by breaking the humans' composure, he would demonstrate humanity's fundamental weakness to the entire Federation. Hunt leader Scarthon of the Vorthak clans employed different tactics. The Vorthak were known throughout the galaxy as trackers without equal, beings who could follow a scent trail across star systems, and whose patience was measured in decades rather than days. Scarthon would appear unexpectedly wherever Chen traveled within the station, always maintaining what terrestrial experts would recognize as stalking behavior. He never spoke to her directly, but his presence was unmistakable, a shadow that followed her to every meeting, every meal, every moment of attempted solitude. The Nith Collective took perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated approach. The Ninth were a hive mind species, capable of perfect coordination between thousands of individual units. They began to surround Chen in groups, never threatening overtly, but creating an atmosphere of constant surveillance. Their compound eyes would track her every movement, while their mandibles clicked in rhythmic patterns that roughly translated to weakness-identified elimination protocols engaged. What none of these apex predators understood was that they were observing a human who had already faced and conquered her greatest enemy, herself. Ambassador Chen's personal files, declassified only after the incident, revealed a childhood marked by severe social anxiety and self-doubt. Born in New Singapore to parents who expected academic perfection, she had struggled throughout her youth with what psychologists termed imposter syndrome, a persistent fear that she was inadequate and would eventually be exposed as a fraud. This internal battle had followed her through university, where despite graduating summa cum laude in xenosociology, she convinced herself that she had succeeded only through luck rather than ability. The breakthrough came during her doctoral thesis defense, when a panel of professors had attempted to discredit her groundbreaking research on interspecies communication patterns. For 6 hours, they had grilled her mercilessly, questioning not just her conclusions but her methodology, her sources, and ultimately her right to be in the program at all. At the moment when lesser individuals might have crumbled, something fundamental shifted within Sarah Chen. She realized that the voice telling her she was inadequate, the voice she had been fighting her entire life, was not based in reality but in fear. Once she recognized that internal enemy, she could defeat it. The moment you stop believing your own self-doubt, she had written in her personal journal that night, is the moment you become truly dangerous to those who would use fear as a weapon. Now facing beings whose evolutionary path had made them masters of intimidation, Ambassador Chen found herself almost amused by their tactics. She had spent decades learning to ignore the voice that told her she wasn't good enough, wasn't strong enough, wasn't worthy of her position. These alien predators were simply external manifestations of fears she had already conquered. During the third week of the summit, the intimidation campaign reached its crescendo. War Prime Zethkar, growing frustrated by Chen's apparent immunity to fear, decided to escalate the confrontation. During a formal session on trade route negotiations, he stood from his delegation's position and spoke in what the universal translator rendered as barely controlled rage. "The Federation has made an error admitting these humans," Zethkar announced, his words carrying the weight of millennia of predatory dominance. "Look at their representative. Soft flesh, vulnerable organs, no natural weapons. They cower in climate-controlled environments and fear the darkness between stars. What contribution could such prey animals possibly make to our alliance of hunters?" The chamber fell silent. Representatives from dozens of species watched as the War Prime approached Chen's position, each thunderous step echoing in the suddenly still air. When he reached her desk, he leaned down, bringing his scarred head within inches of hers. His voice dropped to what the Krillians considered a killing whisper. "I have personally ended the lives of 17 species that I deemed unworthy of sharing the galaxy with true predators. Your kind will be the 18th. Ambassador Chen looked up at the towering alien warrior, her expression unchanged, and asked in a conversational tone that carried clearly throughout the chamber, "Are you quite finished?" The simplicity of the response seemed to confuse Zethkar momentarily. He had expected fear, pleading, perhaps even aggressive posturing that would justify immediate retaliation. Instead, he found himself facing a calm certainty that he didn't understand. "You mistake me for someone who still listens to voices that tell her she should be afraid," Chen continued, rising from her seat. Standing at barely 1.7 meters, she should have been dwarfed by the Krillians' imposing presence. Instead, something in her demeanor made Zethkar unconsciously step backward. "I spent the first 30 years of my life convinced that I wasn't good enough, strong enough, or worthy enough to succeed. Do you know what I discovered when I finally stopped believing those voices?" The War Prime remained silent, though his mandibles twitched with barely controlled aggression. "I discovered that, once you've defeated the enemy within yourself, the voice that whispers you're weak, that you don't belong, that you can't possibly succeed against overwhelming odds, every external threat becomes manageable by comparison." Chen's voice remained steady, conversational, but every representative in the chamber recognized the steel underlying her words. "You think you're dealing with prey, War Prime. You're actually facing something far more dangerous. A human who has already destroyed her weak self." The confrontation concluded with Zethkar returning to his delegation's section, but the damage to the Predator's psychological warfare campaign was already done. Word spread quickly throughout the station's diplomatic community that the human representative had faced down one of the galaxy's most feared warriors without showing the slightest indication of fear or submission. This only intensified the apex predator's determination to break her. Hunt leader Scarthan increased his stalking behavior, now appearing not just in public areas but somehow gaining access to restricted sections where Chen was scheduled to have private meetings. His ability to anticipate her movements should have been disturbing, but Chen found herself analyzing his patterns instead. "Predictable," she noted in her daily reports. "Advanced hunting instincts, but relies too heavily on psychological intimidation rather than tactical adaptation." The Nith Collective began coordinating larger groups, sometimes surrounding Chen with dozens of their units in what they clearly intended as an overwhelming display of numerical superiority. Their mistake was assuming that someone who had spent decades fighting an internal enemy that never rested, never relented, and knew all of her weaknesses would be intimidated by external numbers. As the summit entered its final phases, the Apex Predator Coalition realized that their psychological warfare had not only failed but had somehow strengthened their target. Ambassador Chen moved through the station with a confidence that seemed to grow rather than diminish under pressure. She conducted negotiations with increasing effectiveness, her proposals gaining support from species that had initially been skeptical of human membership in the Federation. War Prime Zethkar called for a meeting of the Predator Coalition in a secured chamber deep within Kepler Station's military sector. The room was designed for beings accustomed to violence. Reinforced walls, atmospheric processes capable of handling exotic biochemistries, and neural dampeners that prevented psychic species from eavesdropping on sensitive discussions. The human has proven more resilient than anticipated, Zethkar admitted, his pride clearly wounded by the failed intimidation campaign. Traditional psychological pressure has been ineffective. Hunt leader Scarthon's response came through the universal translator as a series of growls and clicking sounds that roughly translated to agreement. The prey acts as though it does not recognize its place in the natural order. This suggests either evolutionary anomaly or dangerous delusion. The Ninth Collective's contribution came from their primary speaker unit, a being whose role was to translate the hive mind's collective thoughts into individual communication. Consensus achieved. Standard intimidation protocols have failed. Target demonstrates unexpected psychological resilience. Recommendation: escalate to direct threat assessment. The conversation that followed would later be reconstructed through testimony from various sources and sensor logs, though the full extent of the Predator's planning remained classified until the incident's conclusion. What became clear was that the three species had decided to abandon psychological warfare in favor of a more direct approach. The Federation's charter prohibits unprovoked aggression against member species, Zethkar noted, though his tone suggested this was an obstacle rather than a deterrent. However, if the humans were to demonstrate clear evidence of hostile intent, the plan they developed was elegant in its simplicity and catastrophic in its miscalculation. They would engineer a scenario where Ambassador Chen would be isolated, outnumbered, and forced into a position where her only options were submission or resistance. If she submitted, it would demonstrate human weakness to the entire Federation. If she resisted, it could be portrayed as unprovoked aggression, justifying retaliation and potentially humanity's expulsion from the galactic community. What the apex predators failed to understand was that they were dealing with a species that had spent its entire evolutionary history fighting the most dangerous enemy of all, themselves. Every human who achieved anything significant had first conquered the voice that whispered they weren't good enough, weren't strong enough, weren't worthy of success. Those who completed this internal victory emerged with something that no apex predator could truly comprehend: the absolute certainty that external threats, no matter how overwhelming they appeared, were merely shadows compared to the enemy they had already defeated. Ambassador Chen, reviewing her security briefings in her quarters that night, noticed several concerning patterns in the day's events. The apex predator's behavior was shifting from intimidation to what intelligence analysts would recognize as pre-attack positioning. Scarthon's stalking had become more systematic, suggesting reconnaissance rather than psychological warfare. The Nith Collective's groups were no longer simply surrounding her, but had begun what appeared to be tactical assessments of her movement patterns and defensive capabilities. Most telling was War Prime Zethkar's change in demeanor. The Krillian had stopped his direct confrontations, but his four eyes now tracked her with the cold calculation of a predator selecting the optimal moment to strike. Chen recognized this shift because she had spent years learning to identify the moment when internal self-doubt transitioned from whispered discouragement to active sabotage. As she prepared for what intelligence reports suggested might be the Coalition's final gambit, Ambassador Chen reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. Every achievement in her life had required her to overcome the voice that insisted she wasn't capable, wasn't worthy, wasn't strong enough to succeed. Each victory over that internal enemy had made the next challenge seem more manageable. "They think they're preparing to hunt prey," she wrote in her final journal entry before the incident. "They don't realize they've cornered something that has already survived the most dangerous hunt of all, the one where the predator and prey share the same mind." The stage was set for what would become known throughout the galaxy as proof of an ancient Terran wisdom: the individual who destroys their weak self can never be destroyed by others. Part 2. The Crucible, the engineered confrontation, began during the summit's final diplomatic reception, held in Kepler Station's Grand Assembly Hall. The event was designed to celebrate successful negotiations and strengthen interspecies relationships through cultural exchange and informal dialogue. The hall itself was a marvel of engineering. A spherical chamber nearly 200 meters in diameter, with artificial gravity generators creating multiple orientation zones that allowed species with different physiological requirements to interact comfortably. Ambassador Chen arrived precisely on schedule, wearing formal diplomatic attire that included several subtle technological enhancements: a personal shield generator disguised as a brooch, communications equipment integrated into her jewelry, and what appeared to be decorative elements that were actually sophisticated scanning devices. Her intelligence briefings had indicated elevated threat levels, but Federation protocol required her attendance at all major diplomatic functions. The reception proceeded normally for the first 2 hours. Representatives from dozens of species mingled in their designated atmospheric zones, sharing cultural artifacts and engaging in the careful dance of galactic diplomacy. Chen moved through the gathering with practiced ease, her conversations flowing smoothly between topics ranging from trade agreements to cultural exchange programs. What she didn't notice initially was the subtle choreography being performed by the Apex Predator Coalition. War Prime Zethkar positioned himself near one of the hall's primary exits, engaging in animated conversation with delegates from the Centauri Mining Consortium, a discussion that effectively blocked that particular route without appearing intentional. Hunt leader Scarthan had somehow gained access to the service corridors, his presence confirmed by brief glimpses caught by security sensors but dismissed by station personnel as authorized diplomatic security. The Ninth Collective's strategy was the most sophisticated. Rather than moving as obviously coordinated groups, individual Ninth units had dispersed throughout the reception, each one positioned at what military analysts would later recognize as optimal tactical points for controlling crowd movement and escape routes. To casual observation, they appeared to be mingling normally with other delegates. The trap was sprung during what should have been a routine cultural presentation. The Altarian delegation had requested permission to demonstrate their species' traditional harmony weaving, a form of artistic expression that combined vocal patterns with bioluminescent display. The presentation required dimmed lighting throughout the hall, creating shadows and reducing visibility in ways that would normally be considered minor inconveniences. As the lights dimmed and the Altarian performance began, Ambassador Chen found herself gradually isolated from other delegates. What appeared to be natural crowd movement was actually the result of carefully coordinated positioning by Ninth units, each one creating subtle obstacles that guided other attendees away from Chen's location. Within minutes, she stood in a section of the hall that had become effectively empty, except for the closing triangle of apex predators. The realization struck her simultaneously with the first direct threat. War Prime Zethkar's voice cut through the harmonic performance, his words pitched at a frequency that wouldn't interfere with the Altarian display, but would be clearly audible to Chen and any nearby recording devices. "Ambassador Chen!" he called softly, his tone carrying the false courtesy that predators often employed before striking. "How convenient to find you in such a secluded location." Chen turned to face him, immediately recognizing the tactical situation. Zethkar approached from her primary exit route, while Hunt leader Scarthan emerged from the shadows near the service corridor access. The Nith Collective units began moving inward, their positions creating an ever-tightening perimeter that would soon become inescapable. "Gentlemen," Chen replied, her voice maintaining the diplomatic pleasantries even as her enhanced scanning equipment began analyzing threat levels and potential defensive options. "I trust you're enjoying the cultural exchange." "Oh, we are indeed," Scarthan responded, his words translated from a series of growls that suggested barely controlled hunting instincts. "Though we find ourselves curious about human cultural practices, specifically how your species responds when faced with overwhelming odds." The Nith speaker unit added its contribution to what was clearly a rehearsed confrontation. "Collective assessment indicates current scenario provides optimal testing environment for prey response patterns. Educational opportunity presents itself." Ambassador Chen felt the familiar internal whisper that had haunted her youth. The voice that suggested she was out of her depth, facing opponents beyond her capability, doomed to failure and humiliation. For a brief moment, she experienced the same sensation that had once paralyzed her during university presentations and early career challenges. Then she remembered what she had learned through decades of internal warfare. That voice was not based in reality, but in fear. And once you recognized it as false, it lost all power over you. "Interesting," she said conversationally, as though discussing weather patterns rather than facing what appeared to be imminent violence. "You've gone to considerable effort to engineer this scenario. Coordinated positioning, tactical isolation, psychological pressure tactics. Quite sophisticated for what I assume is meant to be a demonstration of human weakness. War Prime Zefkar's mandibles clicked in what might have been surprise at her calm response. You recognize your situation, yet show no appropriate fear response. This suggests either supreme confidence or dangerous delusion. Neither, actually, Chen replied, checking her chronometer with casual precision. Just experience with enemies that are far more dangerous than you are. Hunt leader Scarthon's growl carried undertones of confusion. No enemies present except us. Sensors confirm human isolation. Backup unavailable. Odds calculated at 3 apex predator species against single prey animal. You're absolutely correct about the tactical situation, Chen agreed. But you've misidentified the most dangerous enemy in this scenario. The statement seemed to confuse all 3 predators momentarily. They had expected fear, pleading, aggressive posturing, or desperate attempts at escape. Instead, they faced a human who appeared to be conducting a classroom discussion on tactical analysis. Chen continued as though she hadn't noticed their confusion. The most dangerous enemy any individual faces is always internal. The voice that whispers, "You're not good enough, not strong enough, not worthy of success." I spent decades fighting that enemy. Would you like to know what I learned when I finally defeated it? A psychological misdirection attempt noted, the Nayet speaker unit announced. Irrelevant to current tactical reality. Recommend proceeding with demonstration protocols. I learned, Chen said, her voice remaining conversational despite the increasingly aggressive postures of her opponents, that once you've conquered the enemy within yourself, every external threat becomes manageable by comparison. You 3 represent physical danger, certainly, but you're nowhere near as dangerous as the internal voice that used to tell me I wasn't capable of handling situations like this. War Prime Zefkar decided that enough psychological maneuvering had occurred. The Krillian War doctrine was based on the principle that hesitation led to defeat, and Chen's apparent immunity to intimidation suggested it was time for direct action. He reached for the ceremonial blade that all Krillian warriors carried, a weapon that was both cultural symbol and lethal instrument. Enough, he declared. Your species will learn through demonstration that this galaxy belongs to true predators. What happened next would be analyzed by military strategists for decades. Ambassador Chen's response to the direct threat was so precise, so devastatingly effective, and so completely unexpected that initial reports were dismissed as fabrication until multiple independent sensor logs confirmed every detail. Rather than retreating or attempting to call for help, Chen stepped forward, directly toward the larger threat. 10 rounds, she said quietly, her hand moving to what appeared to be a decorative element of her formal attire. That's all I brought to this party. The decorative element was, in fact, a weapon that no apex predator had expected a diplomatic representative to carry. Terran military technology had developed along different evolutionary paths than most galactic civilizations, where other species had focused on energy weapons, exotic matter manipulation, or bioengineered combat forms. Humans had perfected the art of accelerating small projectiles to extreme velocities with devastating precision. The device Chen carried was a marvel of miniaturized engineering, a projectile weapon no larger than a writing instrument, capable of firing 10 rounds of magnetically accelerated ceramic composite at velocities that could penetrate most known defensive systems. It had been designed specifically for diplomatic protection scenarios where traditional weapons would be inappropriate or impossible to conceal. War Prime Zefkar had begun to raise his ceremonial blade when the first round struck him precisely in the joint where his primary right arm connected to his torso. The impact was surgical in its precision, not immediately fatal, but completely disabling his weapon arm in a shower of ichor and chitin fragments. The second round struck Hunt leader Scarthon's left knee joint before the Vorthak warrior had even realized that combat had begun. The projectile shattered the cartilage and bone structure that supported his considerable mass, dropping him to the deck with a howl of pain and surprise. Rounds 3 through 7 were fired in rapid succession at the 9th collective units, each shot targeting the neural relay nodes that connected individual units to the hive mind network. Venith had distributed themselves tactically, but Chen's enhanced scanning equipment had identified their biological weak points during the initial confrontation. Each hit severed a unit's connection to the collective consciousness, leaving it disoriented and incapable of coordinated action. Round 8 struck War Prime Zefkar's secondary weapon hand as he attempted to draw a backup blade with his remaining functional arm. The precision of the shot, fired while Chen maintained conversational eye contact, sent the weapon spinning across the chamber floor. Hunt leader Scarthon, despite his damaged leg, attempted to reach Chen's position using the upper body strength that had made Vorthak warriors legendary hunters. Round 9 caught him precisely in the shoulder joint, spinning him away from his intended trajectory and leaving him sprawled on the deck with 2 major limbs rendered inoperative. Ambassador Chen held the final round in reserve as she surveyed the results of her surgical dismantling of 3 apex predator species representatives. The entire engagement had lasted less than 10 seconds, too brief for the Alterian performance to be interrupted or for other delegates to realize that violence had occurred in their midst. 10 rounds, she repeated, her weapon trained on War Prime Zethkar's center mass. I brought exactly what I needed for this conversation. The War Prime, ichor streaming from his wounds but his pride intact, managed to speak through what the translator rendered as considerable pain. Impossible. Humans are catalogued as prey species. No apex predator instincts. No killer evolution. You're absolutely right, Chen agreed. We didn't evolve as apex predators. We evolved as something far more dangerous, a species that spends its entire development fighting the most sophisticated enemy of all. Every human who achieves anything significant has first defeated an internal opponent that knows all their weaknesses, never rests, and whispers constantly that they're not good enough to succeed. She maintained her defensive position while continuing what had become an impromptu lesson in human psychology. That internal enemy is more dangerous than any external threat, because it has unlimited access to our fears, our doubts, our memories of every previous failure. When we finally learn to defeat that voice, when we destroy our weak selves, external enemies become simple by comparison. Hunt leader Scarthon, still conscious despite his injuries, managed a question through his species equivalent of groaning. Why not kill? Standard predator protocol demands elimination of threats. Ambassador Chen's response carried the patient tone of someone explaining elementary concepts to slow students. Because killing you would only prove that humans can be dangerous when threatened. Letting you live proves something far more valuable, that humans can show restraint even when holding overwhelming tactical advantage. The Nith Collective's remaining functional units had gathered around their speaker unit, which was struggling to process the scenario without input from its disabled companions. Collective assessment requires recalibration. Human prey classification appears inaccurate. Very inaccurate, Chen confirmed. We're not prey animals. We're not apex predators either. We're something that doesn't exist elsewhere in the galaxy, a species that has spent millions of years learning to defeat the most dangerous enemy possible, the one that shares our own minds. As station security finally responded to automated alerts triggered by weapons discharge, Ambassador Chen secured her firearm and activated her emergency medical beacon. The apex predators would survive their wounds, though all 3 would require extensive reconstruction of damaged joints and nervous systems. The incident report filed by Station Commander Relix Vaughn noted several unusual aspects of the confrontation. Most significantly, despite being outnumbered 3-1 by established predator species, the human representative had maintained complete tactical control throughout the engagement. Her precision in disabling rather than killing suggested not just superior marksmanship, but remarkable psychological discipline under extreme pressure. The human ambassador's response to coordinated intimidation and physical threat demonstrates capabilities that require immediate reassessment of species classification, Commander Vaughn wrote in his confidential report to Federation Intelligence. Recommend upgrading human status from provisional member prey species to full member tactical threat assessment pending. But the most significant development was yet to come. Word of the incident spread through the galactic diplomatic community with the speed that only truly shocking news achieves. The story that emerged was not of a lucky human who had managed to survive an encounter with apex predators, but of a representative who had systematically and surgically dismantled 3 of the galaxy's most feared warrior species without losing her conversational composure. The recording devices that had captured Chen's explanations during the confrontation were analyzed by xenopsychologists throughout the Federation. Her statements about humans fighting internal enemies, about destroying weak selves to become immune to external threats, about precision rather than brutality, all of this suggested a species that approached conflict from psychological angles that established predators couldn't comprehend. War Prime Zethkar, Hunt leader Scarthon, and the Ninth Collective representatives were treated in Kepler Station's advanced medical facility and made full recoveries from their injuries. However, their reports to their respective governments described an encounter that challenged fundamental assumptions about galactic power dynamics. The Krillian hegemony had built its reputation on the principle that superior firepower and aggressive tactics could overcome any opponent. Zethkar's report described a human who had neutralized his advantages through precision, preparation, and psychological tactics that turned his own aggression against him. The Vorthak clans prided themselves on patient hunting and the ability to exploit any weakness in their prey. Scarthon's analysis noted that the human had demonstrated patience superior to established hunting species, combined with observational skills that identified and exploited weaknesses he hadn't realized he possessed. The Ninth Collective's hive mind intelligence had always assumed that distributed thinking and coordinated action provided tactical superiority over individual consciousness. Their report described a single human mind that had outmaneuvered their collective intelligence through strategies that none of their individual units had anticipated. All three reports reached the same conclusion. Humanity represented something unprecedented in galactic civilization, a species that had evolved not as predators or prey, but as beings capable of defeating themselves and thereby becoming immune to external defeat. As Ambassador Chen prepared her own incident report, she reflected on the irony of the situation. The apex predators had engineered a confrontation designed to expose human weakness, only to discover a strength they couldn't comprehend. They had expected to face prey and instead encountered something far more dangerous, an individual who had already won the only battle that truly mattered. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, she wrote in her conclusions. Today, 3 species learned this lesson. Tomorrow, the galaxy will need to decide what it means for the future of interspecies relations. The incident at Kepler Station marked the end of humanity's provisional status within the Galactic Federation and the beginning of a fundamental shift in how established powers understood the nature of strength, weakness, and survival in an increasingly complex universe. Part 3. The Reckoning. The immediate aftermath of the Kepler Station incident created shockwaves that rippled through the political and military hierarchies of every major galactic power. Within 72 hours, emergency sessions had been called by the Federation Council, the Apex Predator Coalition, and dozens of individual species governments. The question being debated in chambers across known space was deceptively simple. If humans weren't prey animals as originally classified, and clearly weren't traditional apex predators, what exactly were they? The answer would reshape galactic politics for centuries to come. Federation Intelligence Director Kethvas Moran, Andromedari, whose species had served as neutral observers and analysts for over 3 millennia, convened the most comprehensive threat assessment in Federation history. The analysis team included representatives from 47 species, ranging from energy beings who existed primarily as consciousness, to hive minds that processed information across multiple dimensional planes. The preliminary report, classified at the highest levels of Federation security, contained findings that challenged fundamental assumptions about evolution, consciousness, and survival. Human psychological development follows a pattern unknown in previously catalogued species. Rather than evolving primarily for external survival challenges, human consciousness appears to have developed sophisticated internal conflict resolution mechanisms. Every human individual engages in what can only be described as psychological warfare with aspects of their own mind that question their capabilities, worth, and right to success. The report continued with observations that disturbed even veteran xenopsychologists. This internal conflict persists throughout human development, creating a species where individual members are simultaneously their own greatest threat and their own most sophisticated defense system. Those humans who successfully resolve this internal warfare emerge with psychological resilience that appears to be functionally unlimited. Director Moran's personal assessment, appended to the official report, was even more direct. We have discovered a species that has spent its entire evolutionary history fighting itself and winning. The implications for galactic power structures are significant. Meanwhile, in the medical facilities of Kepler Station, the 3 apex predator representatives were receiving visitors from their respective governments. The conversations that took place in these meetings, reconstructed from security recordings and testimony, revealed the scope of the miscalculation that had led to the confrontation. War Prime Zethkar received a delegation from the Krillian High Command that included Supreme War Leader Gastaran, the individual responsible for the hegemony's military doctrine and strategic planning. The conversation began with traditional expressions of concern for Zefkar's injuries and quickly evolved into a detailed tactical analysis. Explain again how a single human neutralized your combat effectiveness in less than 10 seconds, Supreme War Leader Garstern demanded, his translator rendering the question with the cold precision that characterized Krillian military inquiries. Zefkar, his wounded arm encased in regeneration foam and his pride still smarting from the encounter, struggled to find words that would adequately convey what he had experienced. The human's tactical approach was unprecedented. No psychological preparation, no aggressive posturing, no attempt to establish dominance through intimidation. She simply identified our weakness and exploited it with surgical precision. What weakness? Gastard's four eyes focused intently on his subordinate. You are a war prime with 7 centuries of combat experience. Hunt leader Scarthon has personally tracked and eliminated endangered species across multiple star systems. The Ninth Collective's tactical coordination capabilities are unmatched in known space. What weakness could a prey animal possibly exploit? The question hung in the sterile air of the medical facility while Zefkar processed the implications of his answer. Instead, we encountered calculation. The human analyzed our positions, identified our critical vulnerabilities, and neutralized our advantages before we realized combat had begun. Supreme War Leader Garstern absorbed this information while reviewing tactical recordings from the incident. The precision of Ambassador Chen's targeting was indeed surgical, each shot designed to disable rather than kill, but placed with accuracy that suggested extensive knowledge of alien anatomy and tactical weak points. More concerning, Garstern noted after studying the recordings, is the human psychological profile during the engagement. No elevated stress indicators, no panic responses, no deviation from conversational norms. She conducted systematic combat operations while maintaining diplomatic discourse. This suggests psychological conditioning beyond anything in our experience. The conversation between Hunt leader Scarthon and his Vorthak clan superiors followed similar patterns, though with cultural variations that reflected their species' hunting-based social structure. High Tracker Morthak, the eldest and most experienced hunter in the clans, had traveled personally to interview Scarthon about the incident. The human demonstrated patience superior to our most accomplished hunters, Scarthon reported through bandages covering his reconstructed knee joint. But more than patience, she showed the ability to remain perfectly calm while surrounded by multiple apex predators in a contained environment. This level of psychological control suggests evolutionary adaptations we failed to identify. High Tracker Morthak's response carried the weight of centuries of hunting experience. No prey species develops such capabilities naturally. Prey animals respond to threat with flight, submission, or desperate aggression. This human exhibited none of these responses. Instead, she displayed what can only be described as apex confidence, but without the aggression patterns that characterize traditional predators. The analysis from the Nith Collective proved even more disturbing to established galactic powers. As a hive mind species, the Nith processed information through collective consciousness, allowing them to analyze complex scenarios from multiple perspectives simultaneously. Their assessment of the incident carried the weight of thousands of individual minds working in perfect coordination. The collective's report, transmitted directly to Federation intelligence, contained observations that challenged basic assumptions about consciousness and individual capability. Human individual demonstrated tactical awareness and decision-making speed that exceeded collective processing capabilities. Single consciousness outmaneuvered distributed intelligence through strategies that individual collective units could not predict or counter. The report continued with analysis that sent tremors through every government in the Federation. Human success appears based on psychological conditioning that eliminates self-doubt and internal interference with decision-making processes. Individual consciousness operates with efficiency typically associated only with artificial intelligence systems, but retains creativity and adaptability that synthetic minds cannot achieve. As these reports circulated through intelligence networks and government channels, a pattern began emerging. Ambassador Chen's success hadn't been based on superior technology, greater physical strength, or traditional predatory instincts. Instead, she had demonstrated something that no other species in the galaxy possessed: the ability to function with perfect psychological clarity under extreme pressure, because she had already defeated the most sophisticated enemy possible, her own self-doubt. The implications were staggering. If humans routinely engaged in psychological warfare with their own minds and emerged victorious, they possessed mental conditioning that made them functionally immune to external intimidation. More troubling still, those humans who successfully completed this internal victory appeared to develop tactical capabilities that could neutralize traditional predator advantages through precision and calculation rather than aggression. Federation xenopsychologist Dr. Stayavati Donal Kekstara, whose species had served as neutral observers of interspecies psychology for over 2 millennia, published a confidential analysis that would later become known as the Human Paradox Report. Humanity represents an evolutionary path previously unknown to galactic science. Rather than developing as predators or prey, they evolved as beings engaged in constant internal conflict with aspects of their own consciousness. This internal warfare produces individuals who are simultaneously capable of extreme self-doubt and absolute psychological certainty. The report continued with observations that redefined galactic understanding of psychological evolution. Humans who successfully resolve their internal conflicts emerge with mental conditioning that makes external threats appear manageable by comparison. They have already defeated an enemy that knows all their weaknesses, never rests, and has unlimited access to their fears and doubts. Once this internal victory is achieved, external opponents become merely tactical problems to be solved. Dr. Kekstara's conclusions prove prophetic. The galaxy now faces a species that cannot be intimidated because they have already conquered fear, cannot be broken because they have already rebuilt themselves, and cannot be defeated because they have already won the only battle that truly matters, the one against their own limitations. The political ramifications of these revelations became apparent during emergency sessions of the Federation Council. Species that had dominated galactic politics for millennia found themselves reassessing their strategic positions in light of humanity's demonstrated capabilities. The Altarian hegemony, which had maintained power through careful diplomatic manipulation and the threat of economic sanctions, realized that their traditional methods might be ineffective against a species that appeared immune to psychological pressure. Chancellor Vexmiran's private communications, later leaked to Federation media, revealed the scope of established powers' concerns. How do you negotiate with beings who cannot be intimidated, cannot be made to doubt themselves, and respond to overwhelming odds by becoming more focused rather than more desperate? The Centauri Mining Consortium, whose influence stemmed from controlling access to rare resources essential for faster-than-light travel, discovered that their economic leverage might be meaningless against humans who had already proven capable of achieving strategic objectives regardless of apparent disadvantages. Corporate analysis suggested that human psychological conditioning made them ideal candidates for high-risk exploration and resource development in sectors that other species considered too dangerous. Perhaps most significantly, the military implications of human capabilities began receiving serious attention from Federation Defense Command. General Thexvar Dornish, the Federation's chief strategic analyst, compiled a classified assessment that would influence military planning for decades. Human tactical capabilities appear to increase under pressure rather than decrease. Their psychological conditioning allows them to maintain perfect clarity and precision while facing overwhelming odds. This suggests that traditional military doctrine, based on breaking enemy morale through superior force, may be ineffective against human opponents. The assessment continued with recommendations that shocked military leaders throughout the Federation. Recommend immediate reassessment of human capabilities and potential military applications. A species that routinely defeats internal opponents possessing unlimited knowledge of their weaknesses may prove capable of tactical achievements previously considered impossible. As these various reports and assessments circulated through government and military channels, a consensus began emerging among galactic powers. Humanity needed to be reclassified from provisional member, harmless herbivores, to something unprecedented in Federation taxonomy. The official reclassification came during an emergency session of the Federation Council held 6 weeks after the Kepler Station incident. Ambassador Chen, fully recovered from her confrontation with the apex predators, and now accompanied by a full diplomatic security detail, presented humanity's formal response to the incident and their species' new status within the Federation. The recent events at Kepler Station have raised questions about human capabilities and classification within the galactic community, Chen began, addressing the assembled representatives with the same calm precision she had demonstrated during the confrontation. My government wishes to clarify several misconceptions that may have influenced recent discussions. The chamber fell silent as delegates from across the galaxy focused on the human representative who had single-handedly defeated 3 apex predator species without apparent effort. Humanity does not seek classification as apex predators. As we do not base our identity on the defeat of external enemies, we do not request special consideration as victims, as we do not consider ourselves prey to be protected by others. Instead, we propose a new classification that accurately reflects both our capabilities and our intentions. Ambassador Chen paused, allowing her words to be processed by the sophisticated translation systems that enabled interspecies communication. When she continued, her voice carried the certainty of someone who had already fought and won the only battle that mattered. Humanity requests classification as evolved cooperators, beings who have achieved psychological independence through internal victory and therefore possess the mental clarity necessary for true cooperation with external allies. We offer our capabilities in service of galactic stability, scientific advancement, and peaceful exploration of unknown territories. The proposal seemed modest compared to the demonstrated capabilities that had prompted the emergency session. However, Xenop psychologists throughout the chamber recognized the implications of Chen's carefully chosen words. A species that described itself as having achieved psychological independence through internal victory was claiming capabilities that no other known civilization possessed. Federation Council President Zarthek Vornash, representing a species that had served as neutral arbitrators for over 5 millennia, called for formal voting on humanity's reclassification. The debate that followed would later be studied as a masterclass in galactic diplomacy. Species after species rose to address the human proposal, each one grappling with the implications of formally recognizing a civilization that appeared to possess tactical capabilities beyond traditional classification systems. The Regelian Confederacy supported the proposal, noting that human psychological conditioning might prove valuable in deep space exploration missions where isolation and uncertainty had previously made long-term missions impossible. The Vegan Trade Alliance endorsed human reclassification based on their demonstrated ability to maintain perfect composure under extreme pressure, a skill set that could revolutionize negotiations in high-stakes commercial ventures. Even former skeptics found themselves supporting humanity's new status. The Betelgeuse military complex, initially concerned about human tactical capabilities, concluded that beings who had already conquered their own weaknesses would make ideal allies precisely because they could be trusted to act rationally rather than emotionally during crisis situations. The final vote was unanimous, 847 species supporting humanity's reclassification as evolved cooperators, 0 opposition, and 12 abstentions from civilizations that requested additional time to analyze the implications. Ambassador Chen's response to the vote demonstrated the psychological conditioning that had impressed observers throughout the crisis. Humanity accepts this classification with gratitude and humility. We look forward to contributing our unique capabilities to galactic civilization while continuing to learn from species whose evolutionary paths have produced their own remarkable achievements. The session concluded with formal recognition of humanity as the first species in galactic history to achieve evolved cooperator status, a classification that would later be extended to only 3 other civilizations over the following centuries. However, the most significant development occurred not in the public sessions but in the private meetings that followed. Representatives from dozens of species approached Ambassador Chen with requests for consultation on various projects that required the unique psychological conditioning that humans had demonstrated. The Andro-Berry Exploration Corps requested human participation in their deep space archaeology missions, recognizing that psychological resilience would be essential for investigating ancient ruins in regions where isolation and unknown dangers had previously made research impossible. The Sirius Research Collective invited human scientists to join their consciousness studies, hoping that beings who had successfully mapped and conquered their own internal conflicts might contribute insights into the nature of self-awareness and mental evolution. Most significantly, the Federation Defense Command officially requested human assistance in developing new training protocols for multi-species military units. The ability to maintain tactical clarity while facing overwhelming odds was identified as a crucial skill for forces responsible for protecting galactic civilization from external threats. Each of these invitations represented recognition that humanity had achieved something unprecedented. They had evolved beyond the traditional predator-prey dynamic that characterized most galactic civilizations. Instead, they had become something far more dangerous and far more valuable. Beings who could no longer be defeated by external enemies because they had already conquered their internal ones. Ambassador Chen's final report to Earth Command, transmitted through quantum entanglement communications 6 months after the incident, summarized the transformation in humanity's galactic status. The confrontation at Kepler Station was engineered by apex predators who believed they were testing prey animals. Instead, they discovered that humanity represents something unprecedented in galactic evolution. Beings who have spent their entire development fighting and defeating the most sophisticated enemy possible, themselves. The report continued with analysis that would guide human diplomatic and military strategy for generations. Our species' greatest strength is not our technology, our aggression, or our numbers. It is our psychological conditioning through internal conflict resolution. Every human who achieves success has first defeated an internal opponent that possesses unlimited knowledge of their weaknesses and never stops fighting. Once this internal victory is achieved, external threats become merely tactical problems to be solved. Ambassador Chen's final paragraph became required reading at every human diplomatic training facility. The galaxy now understands that the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. This recognition has transformed humanity from provisional members seeking acceptance to evolved cooperators whose unique capabilities are essential for galactic civilization's continued development. The incident at Kepler Station marked the end of humanity's struggle for recognition within the galactic community and the beginning of their emergence as a species whose psychological evolution had produced capabilities that traditional predator-prey classifications could not adequately describe. War Prime Zethkar, Hunt Leader Scarthon, and the Ninth Collective representatives recovered fully from their injuries and returned to their respective civilizations with new understanding of human capabilities. Their reports contributed to fundamental changes in how apex predator species approached interspecies relations, recognizing that psychological conditioning could prove more decisive than traditional physical advantages. The three species that had engineered the confrontation became, paradoxically, some of humanity's strongest advocates within their respective governments. They had experienced firsthand the reality that beings who had conquered their internal enemies could not be defeated through external intimidation. As galactic civilization adapted to accommodate humanity's unique evolutionary path, one truth became clear to every species in the Federation. They were no longer dealing with prey animals or competing apex predators. They were cooperating with beings who had achieved something far more remarkable: victory over themselves. The document concludes with Ambassador Chen's words echoing through the halls of power across known space. "We came to the galaxy not as conquerors seeking to impose our will, but as beings who had already won the only battle that truly matters. External enemies become simple opponents once you have defeated the voice within yourself that whispers you cannot succeed." The apex predators had intended to demonstrate human weakness. Instead, they had revealed to the galaxy the existence of a strength beyond traditional understanding. The unshakable certainty that comes from destroying one's weak self and emerging capable of facing any external challenge with perfect psychological clarity. Humanity's 10 rounds had been enough. They always would be. End of document classification level. Ultra-secret distribution. Eyes only. Council of Species author. Federation Intelligence Analysis Division final review. Ambassador Sarah Chen, Terran Diplomatic Corps.